English Literature Revision for the Power and Conflict Poetry Cluster, Poppies. First of all, some general advice. Don't focus on what you can't do. You're not expected to teach yourself any new material. Use this time to revise and prepare your revision materials. These will be incredibly useful in Year 11. Set yourself 1 or 2 tasks that you want to achieve and do them. And you can try a variety of different activities. You might decide to just do some online tasks through Seneca or Sam Learning one day, and then the next day you may like to try some written work, and followed by the next day you may prefer to make some revision materials that you can use and revise from. Just a reminder of the set tasks. You can find all of the revision aids to support your revision on the shared area. Go onto the Q drive, into English, into Student Write, and you'll find Year 10 Home Learning and also Year 11 Home Learning and Revision Aids. You can also use Sam Learning and Seneca Learning websites, and your teacher will have set up an account and put all the revision resources available for you to use as and when you can. It's really important that you understand each of the poems. GCSE BBC Bite Size is another good place to start, particularly if you don't have your anthology at home with you, as all the poems are listed. Just look for them under the Power and Conflict cluster. Choose one poem at a time to focus on and make sure you are able to do the following. Imagine you are given a blank copy of the poem. You should be able to briefly explain what the poem is about. You should also have a clear understanding of how that poem links to different poems within the cluster and how they are linked by themes or key ideas. You can also choose, annotate and learn 3 or 4 key quotations from each of those poems. When you've chosen a quotation, you can create some of your own revision cards. Explode those quotations. Think about the connotations of key words. Think about what themes and ideas they symbolise. Explore those alternative and all possible ideas, and then you'll have some good detailed revision cards to help you learn those quotes and those ideas that you can use in your exam. To challenge yourself, you should explore some wider reading and some of the contextual information. There are new resources in the Home Learning folder added all the time to help and support you, and I'll go through this in a little bit more detail later on. Poppies by Jane Weir. 3 days before Armistice Sunday, and poppies had already been placed on individual war graves. Before you left, I pinned one onto your lapel, crimped petals, spasms of paper red, disrupting a blockade of yellow bias binding around your blazer. Cellotape bandaged around my hand, I rounded up as many white cat hairs as I could, smoothed down your shirt's upturned collar, steeled the softening of my face. I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, play at being Eskimos like we did when you were little. I resisted the impulse to run my fingers through the gelled black thorns of your hair. All my words flattened, rolled, turned into felt, slowly melting. I was brave as I walked with you to the front door, threw it open, the world overflowing like a treasure chest. A split second and you were away, intoxicated. After you'd gone, I went into your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage. Later, a single dove flew from the pear tree, and this is where it has led me, skirting the churchyard walls, my stomach busy, making tucks, darts, pleats, hatless without a winter coat or reinforcements of scarf, gloves. On reaching the top of the hill, I traced the inscriptions on the war memorial, leaned against it like a wishbone, the dove pulled freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. Firstly, some information about the poet Jane Weir. She was born in 1963 and grew up in Italy and England. During the 1980s, she spent some time in Northern Ireland and witnessed firsthand the effects of war on people all around her. The poem itself was written to go into a collection of poetry in a book called Exit Wounds, put together by Carol Ann Duffy. Each of the poets were asked to write about experiences of war, and Jane Weir was determined to present a slightly different idea of war and wanted to show the impact of war on people left behind to help us understand their suffering. Poppies are worn every year in November, and they are a symbol of remembering those people who've died during war. Armistice Sunday is an event that takes place every year in November, nearest to the 11th of November as possible. And it's an opportunity to remember those people who've died during war. Initially, it was because of the First World War, following the peace talks that happened at that time. But now it's become reflected of all soldiers who've died at any time, and it helps us understand perhaps the loss and grief that war can inflict upon different people. Poppies themselves, therefore, have become symbolic to violence, death, but more importantly, perhaps to memory. But initially, the poem itself throws us into that violent aspect of war where we hear about the war graves. So just looking at that first stanza, we can understand when about the poem is starting. So we know that it was 3 days before Armistice Sunday, and time within the poem is quite significant. So it's written from the perspective of a mother talking to her son. And she describes before you left, that pronoun you, making it very clear that there's a connection between mother and son. She pinned a poppy onto your lapel, crimped petals, spasms of paper red, disrupting a blockade of yellow bias binding around your blazer. There's some quite clear military words being used here. We've got the word blockade, which suggests that somebody can't get through something. It's this idea of blocking. Alternatively, it could be her showing that she's trying to block out those emotions at the time. Perhaps she didn't want her son to see that she was upset. We've got those plosive sounds of blockade, bias, binding, blazer, perhaps representing that idea of battle that the son was just about to be thrust into. And another interesting word to focus in on is spasms. That violent word with those associations perhaps of war and suffering. At the beginning of the second stanza, we can see these 2 different ideas of something that's quite domestic and something that's quite military, where she describes sellotape bandaged around my hand. This is the image where if somebody has sort of cat hair or dog hair, you might put sellotape around your hand to create that sticky pad so that you can remove just simple cat hair or fluff from your uniform. But the word bandaged perhaps makes it feel like something which we'd associate a lot more with war and suffering. This might be reflected of how the mother is trying to protect her son, and perhaps recognising that he's going to be hurt or wounded. As the poem continues, she describes how she smooths down the shirt's upturned collar and steeled the softening of the face. That sibilance, that repeated S sound, perhaps emphasises that calm tone and that protective manner that the woman is trying to portray to her son. She describes perhaps how she wanted to mother him as the stanza continues, and she describes wanting to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, play at being Eskimos. It's perhaps suggestive of a time where she could protect him when he was much younger and much smaller and in little danger. She goes on to talk about resisting the impulse to run fingers through the gelled blackthorns of your hair. Again, literally, the boy probably had spiky hair because of gel, and it's literally this idea of literal sharp hair. We've obviously got that symbolism there, that biblical allusion of possibly linking to Jesus. When Jesus was sent to his death on the cross, he had that crown of thorns around his head, and this perhaps helps us understand the suffering that she recognises not only her son is about to face, but as his mother she is prepared to face as well. At the end of stanza 2 and into stanza 3, we've got that enjambment where we start to hear perhaps how the woman's voice and the woman's emotions are sort of blending and melting away. She describes her words are flattened, rolled, turned into felt and slowly melting. Jane Weir herself was a textile designer as well as a poet, and this part of the poem shows how that natural imagery represents her feelings of being unable to do anything. So just in the same way that material can be flattened and rolled and squashed and almost feel like it's melting away, perhaps it reflects that she is unable to say anything comforting to her son, unable to say something after he's left. And this might be reflected of the fact that she doesn't want to upset her son any further, or perhaps has nothing to say to him in the situation that they're in. But there is a very clear idea that war is not just impacting on her son, it's also impacting on her. In that third stanza, she describes being brave. And at this point, it perhaps contrasts sharply with our idea about who people in war affects. At this point, we'd expect a soldier to be described as brave. But interestingly, it's the mother who is described as brave. For her, losing her son while he goes to war, this dangerous environment, means she also needs to be brave. She describes throwing the door open and the world overflowing like a treasure chest. And that's similarly describing perhaps the excitement and the joy felt by her son at this new adventure. The split second and you were away, intoxicated. It's something that she is unable to save him from. It's an exciting feeling. It's something that he wants to do. The idea of war at this point to her son may have been attractive. He had these opportunities, but for her, perhaps they were less attractive. And this is reflected by explaining what happens immediately after her son leaves. Again, we've got a change of time. After you'd gone, I went into your bedroom and released a songbird from its cage. This could be suggestive of the mother perhaps releasing her grief. The songbird itself is a metaphor, a beautiful caged creature that needs to be set free. And perhaps she recognises that her son also needs that freedom to make his own choices. The poem goes on to describe a single dove flying from a pear tree. Doves have a double meaning, and they can represent peace, perhaps suggesting that she hopes her son is at peace, or she's heard some news that suggests that he is okay. However, doves also represent mourning or even death. Again, this double ambiguous meaning leaves us wondering what has happened to this mother's son. We circle back round to the beginning of the poem at this point as the mother is being led back to the churchyard walls, and we start to look again at the war graves. Once again, that natural imagery, that textile imagery is used perhaps to describe the mother's feelings and the mother's tight emotions. The poet uses a listing technique of tucks, darts and pleats, and that power of 3 suggesting that the mother is perhaps confused, anxious and worried about her son. She also describes her own lack of protection. She says she's hatless without a winter coat or reinforcements of scarves and gloves. And yet again, that military idea of reinforcements perhaps shows us that war is constantly on the mother's mind. She describes reaching the top of the hill and looking carefully at the inscriptions on the war memorial. Again, this could be ambiguous to suggest that she's expecting to see her son's name on there. We're still uncertain whether her son is safe at war or if she's lost her son and he's gone forever. She describes leaning on it like a wishbone. And again, that simile perhaps represents this mother's love for her son and desire to see him safe at home and protected. Once again, we've got the idea of the dove being seen, symbolic again of peace, or perhaps her idea of mourning, pulling freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. This idea of freedom, perhaps something she wishes that her son had. And again, linking it to that textile imagery that is so important in the poet's own voice. She's listening, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. The use of the word playground again suggests this idea of a mother hoping and wishing that her son was once again at home, safe, and perhaps memories of childhood when the world was perhaps a little more innocent. Okay, so at this point, hopefully you'll be able to summarise what the poem is about. You need to understand from whose perspective it's written and what the poet is trying to show us or tell us as the poem continues. You should be able to have annotated your poem with those points that you can remember, and also look at any new ideas that you have as you read it a second time. Choose 3 or 4 quotations which you can explore and explode in detail. So you're looking to explore multiple connotations of individual words. So when you're looking at things like the word blockade, you need to understand how it's got those military references and perhaps explore the more domestic ideas of a blockade of bias binding to perhaps show a mother's sort of innocent love for her small child. You're looking for those obvious techniques like metaphors, similes, powerful verbs, adjectives, but you're also then going to try and explore those alternative meanings and those different layers. We now need to think about the poem's form, and also the structure. So the form is how it appears on the page, and here you might like to explore the ideas of enjambment, and you might like to look at caesura and how that's used. So we'll go through that in a little while. You need to also think about how the poem is structured. That movement to 3 days before and then later when you've gone, there's a clear idea of time passing. So we're perhaps understanding how a mother's grief is moving at different times. So looking at the structure of the poem, there's no clear order or structure to the stanzas. They're all of different lengths and there's no definite clear rhyme or organisation. It's written in free verse, which means that it's purposely not written to rhyme in any regular way, and it gives us an idea perhaps of an outpouring of grief or an outpouring of emotion from the mothers. It's quite a chaotic structure which perhaps symbolises how the mother is feeling and her ideas are just pouring forward. We've got enjambment, which means that some lines in the poem are running into a second line or even over into a different stanza. And this again perhaps helps us understand that the mother's ideas and memories of her son are outpouring in just the same way that her grief is. In contrast to that, there are several moments of the poem where we've got that caesura, we've got that punctuation in the middle of a line, particularly in the last but one line where we talk about the dove pulling freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. And that caesura there forces the reader to stop and pause and perhaps think about those ideas presented in the poem. It could also be showing us how the poem, the mother herself, is pausing and thinking about her son. When we move on to the final lines of the poem, where she says she listened hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind, because we've had that very clear pause, we perhaps also have the opportunity to almost be listening for that voice, thinking about those memories. So it just makes the ideas a little bit clearer when we also think about how the poet herself has structured them. That broken structure and that unclear rhyme scheme could also perhaps show us how the mother's emotions are breaking down. So again, the ideas of a mother trying to hold on to her grief and perhaps unable to do so is reflected in the structure and the form of the poem. The form itself is a monologue, and we have this poet who's presented a persona of the mother, and she is presenting a character talking to her son. We never get to hear the son's ideas, and there could be numerous reasons for that. It could be reflective of the fact that the son has died at war. It could also tell us that the son is unable to communicate, or even the mother may not actually be telling him this information for fear of upsetting him. It's all done to emphasise the pain caused by this mother. Her voice is generally ignored when we talk about the impact of war. We usually get to hear from a soldier's perspective or from people in those war zones. So without the son being able to answer, we're perhaps focusing more on the effect of war to the mother. Okay, so you can expand your ideas a little bit with some contextual research. You may want to start by finding out a little bit about World War I and why poppies were introduced as a symbol of war. Also have a think about the amount of fatalities, and particularly focus your research on how this affects women left at home waiting for news of their sons or husbands. Some other contextual research you may like to do is about the poet herself. So do some research about Jane Weir, and if you have a look about her interest in textiles, it may help you explain this constant use of contrast between domestic and military language. So that textile imagery is really important to perhaps help you also understand a mother's emotions and feelings. You can go onto the British Library website and the resources in your own home learning folder in the shared area. So find out that contextual information to address any other areas, just to support and broaden your analysis of the poem. So now you need to start to think about how you can link the poem Poppies to other poems in the power and conflict cluster. So we need to focus on different themes that the poem suggests. So you've got themes of loss, a mother's loss when her son goes to war, potentially a mother's loss after the death of her son. The poem itself is quite ambiguous about what happens to him after he's gone to war. You've got themes of memory, so memories of him as a child. She describes when he was young, that safety of that Eskimo kiss and that playground voice, perhaps suggesting that innocence. The idea that war impacts others, not just soldiers, so people left behind. And also when we think about the word conflict, we've got conflicting emotions within the poem. Perhaps pride of a mother whose son has gone to war to defend his country, but also that conflicting emotion where she's trying to protect him and look after him. So think about those poems that you would link with them. So poems such as Kamikaze, where we've got an idea of loss and memory and how war affects other people. You've got War Photographer, again where you've perhaps got some very conflicting emotions. And even the Emigre, so the impact of war on other people, not just from a soldier's perspective. All of them are linked obviously through power and conflict, so try and be really specific about those links that you're making and explore in detail about how Poppies links to those key poems that you're studying. So moving on to the exam question, an example question here is how the theme of memory is presented in Poppies and one other poem from the cluster. Your first task will be to write your introduction, explaining how the theme of memory is presented in Poppies and also one other poem of your choice. So you'll need to select that poem carefully to make sure that both of them focus on this idea of memory. After your introduction, you'll need to write your first PEA paragraph and make sure that that one is on Poppies to get you started. Remember, it's your development of your depth of analysis. So look at those multiple connotations of different ideas and words within your quotation and look at more than one word in each of those quotations. Make sure that the quote that you use is relevant to the focus of the question, in this case, memory. As you continue your response, you'll move on to your second PEA paragraph about your other choice of poem. So you'll do that throughout, alternating between Poppies and your own choice of poem. If you aim for 3 PEA paragraphs on each poem, you'll end up with 6 in total, and an introduction and a conclusion. However, please remember it is quality over quantity. So it is much better to have 4 really detailed analytical paragraphs, 2 on each poem, rather than 6 much shallower, shorter paragraphs that are less analytical. Just to give you a rough guide, a really detailed analytical paragraph will take up about 1 side of A4 paper, depending on the size of your handwriting. Remember at the end of your essay to round it off with a conclusion. So look at your introduction, look at the key points you've made in each of those paragraphs and write your conclusion, summing up how the theme of memory is presented in each poem. At this point, you can also describe which of the poem you find most effective in exploring that theme of memory and explain why, just to finalise your exam response. Okay, so looking at the poetry mark scheme, you'll see that to get into levels 5 and 6, you need to be offering thoughtful, developed, or even convincing and critical analysis. That means you need to be aiming to get those top marks between 21 and 30 to be really exploring and explaining and developing your response. So to get those 30 marks, you will get up to 12 marks for assessment objective 1, and that means your knowledge of the poem itself, the key ideas and key themes within the poem and what the poet is trying to show us. You also can get up to 12 marks for assessment objective 2, and that is your ability to analyse language and structure in the poem really well. So that is where your PEA response is going to really hone in on that close analysis of words and phrase. And you'll be using that subject terminology and making sure that you explore the poet's intention and ideas behind the words that they're using. AO3, you can get up to 6 marks, and that is your contextual knowledge of the poem. So that can be your knowledge of the poet herself, or you can look at historical context of when the poem is based. You can also explore this idea of Poppies. But please remember, context is also context within the poem. So if you've chosen a quote at the end of the poem and you feel that it's different from the perhaps ideas that were presented at the beginning of the poem, your understanding of how the poem's changed ideas and moved forward will also get into that assessment objective 3 bracket. Looking a little bit further down the mark scheme, we've got levels 3 and levels 4, and on that left hand column it tells you for level 4 you need clear understanding, and level 3 explain structured comments. This means that to get into just 11 marks to 20 marks, you still need to be offering that explained detail. So don't just put a quotation in and give a very brief response. It needs to be explained, and you need to focus on the language used. to get into your level 4, it's going to be clear understanding. So it's starting to explore the writer's methods and starting to understand how those methods create different meanings, and writing that in a clear and concise way. Okay, just a reminder to go into the shared area and look under English Student Write, either Year 10 Home Learning or Year 11 Home Learning and Revision Guides. You make sure you're using Sam Learning and Seneca Learning websites. So again, your teacher will have set you up as a student, sign in and you go through the different activities available to you. Make sure you understand each of those poems so that you can briefly explain what your poem's about, link your poems by different themes or key ideas, and make sure you've got those revision cards that are really, you've got those quote explosions on there to really start to give you that depth of analysis that you're going to need. Make sure also that you're challenging yourself, so go out there and look at that wider reading and gather that contextual information. There are new resources in the home learning folder that are being added all the time, so just ask if you need any more support.